So today I want to do something that most channels covering this war are not doing. They are reporting what happened. I want to show you what it means. Because what Iran has been doing with its ballistic missiles in this war and what happened to every system designed to stop them is not just a story about rockets and interceptors. It is a story about a system failing, a system the world was told could not fail. And once you understand how that system failed and why nobody in Washington or Tel Aviv was fully prepared for what came next, you start to see something much larger taking shape. Not just a war, a structural collapse, a reckoning that has been building for a decade, now playing out in real time, visible to anyone paying close enough attention. Before I walk you through the details, I want to be very clear about something. This is not speculation. Every number I give you, every operational fact I describe comes from verified sources, from satellite analysis, from official government statements, from defense research institutions that track these things in detail. Because in a war this big with stakes this high, the last thing anyone needs is someone making things up to sound dramatic. The reality is dramatic enough. Let us start with the number that changed everything. In the June 2025 12-day war between Iran and Israel, before the current conflict even began, Iran launched over 500 ballistic missiles at Israel in coordinated salvos. Israel's layered air defense network, which includes Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow 2, and Arrow 3, achieved an interception rate of approximately 86%. On paper, that sounds like success. In practice, it exposed something that Israeli defense planners had understood theoretically but had never been forced to confront operationally at this scale. 14% of 500 missiles is 70 missiles reaching their targets. 70 missiles that penetrated the most expensive, most layered, most technologically sophisticated air defense architecture ever assembled in the Middle East. Nevatim Air Base was struck. The Kiryat, Israel's fortified military headquarters in Tel Aviv, was hit. Residential buildings took direct impacts. 8 civilians were killed when missiles struck apartment buildings in a single morning. And by the end of that 12-day period, Israel was already racing to replenish its interceptor stockpiles. Racing because the Arrow interceptors that form the top tier of Israel's defense cost approximately $4 million each. Every single one that fires is $4 million gone, and Iran had just forced Israel to spend those $4 million again and again to stop missiles that cost a fraction of that to build. That cost exchange is the engine of this war. It is not visible on a map. It does not show up in a single dramatic news headline, but it is the structural reality driving everything. And when the United States and Israel launched their joint strikes on February 28th, 2026, and Iran's full retaliatory campaign began, that engine kicked into a completely different gear. Here is what the structure of Iran's missile campaign in this current conflict actually looks like. And I want you to understand this precisely because it is not what most coverage describes. Iran did not simply fire missiles at Israel and miss. Iran ran a deliberate, calculated saturation campaign designed around one core operational insight. No air defense system in the world, no matter how advanced, can intercept missiles it cannot find in time at a cost it can sustain indefinitely. By March 10th, Israeli defense officials confirmed that 50% of Iranian missiles were now carrying cluster munition warheads. And this is the detail that the coverage has mostly passed over without fully explaining its significance. A single ballistic missile fitted with a cluster munition warhead does not detonate as one weapon when it reaches its target. It disperses hundreds of submunitions across a wide area. One missile can impact 50 separate locations simultaneously. So the defense system now faces a choice. Fire an interceptor worth $3 to $4 million to destroy the incoming missile before it disperses, or allow the missile through and watch hundreds of bomblets fall across a residential neighborhood. And here is the additional trap inside that choice. If the defender fires an interceptor and hits the missile but hits it at the wrong altitude or the wrong angle, the cluster munitions can still disperse. The intercept does not necessarily stop the harm, it just changes how the harm is delivered. By April 1st, confirmed reports showed that 12 Iranian missiles carrying conventional warheads had struck populated areas, causing extensive damage. More than 30 separate incidents of cluster munition warheads hitting populated areas had been recorded. over 200 individual impact sites from cluster submunitions alone. This is the operational picture behind the headline numbers. This is what 500 or 600 or 800 missiles actually mean when half of them are carrying dispersal warheads. The Iron Dome, which was designed to intercept short-range rockets and artillery in the 4 to 70-kilometer range, was not built for this. Its designers have been candid about this. During the June 2025 12-day war, Iron Dome intercepted some medium-range ballistic missiles, which was genuinely impressive and outside its design parameters. But during the 2026 campaign, with around half of Iranian missiles equipped with cluster munition warheads, the defense system is being forced into impossible cost calculations on every intercept. Iron Dome interceptors cost between $100,000 and $200,000 each. Arrow interceptors cost $3 to $4 million each. Iran is producing missiles at an estimated rate of 100 per month from dispersed underground facilities. The United States and Israel have been simultaneously trying to destroy those production facilities and those launchers. And here is what the data shows about how that campaign has gone. By the end of the first week of the current conflict, the combined US and Israeli campaign had eliminated roughly 1/3 of Iran's estimated 100 mobile ballistic missile launchers. By week 6, joint operations claimed to have rendered approximately 3/4 of those launchers combat ineffective. Iranian missile attacks on Israel dropped by more than 90% from their peak by day 10 of the current war. This sounds like a decisive American and Israeli success, but the constraint underneath that success is the word that matters. The word is combat ineffective. A launcher buried under rubble is combat ineffective for the period it is buried. A launcher relocated and reactivated is not. And Iran has been rebuilding. Israeli intelligence assessments published in early 2026 projected that Iran's missile stockpile, estimated at 2,000 to 3,000 units after the June 2025 conflict, could rebuild to 5,000 missiles by 2027 at current production rates, could reach 8,000 to 10,000 by the end of the decade under accelerated production. These are not speculative numbers. These are the numbers Israeli defense planners are working from right now as they accelerate Arrow interceptor production, because they understand that what has happened in this conflict is not the end of Iran's missile program. It is a setback with a recovery timeline measured in months, not years. Now let us talk about the Strait of Hormuz. Because everything I have described so far, the missile volumes, the cluster munitions, the interceptor costs, all of it connects directly to what happened to the world's most critical energy choke point. And that connection is the part of this story that is most consequential for every person on the planet, not just the people under missile alerts in Tel Aviv or Haifa. Since February 28, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed to commercial shipping. Before this war, between 100 and 120 commercial vessels passed through the strait every single day. By the first week of March, that number had collapsed to a trickle. The IRGC Navy issued warnings forbidding passage. Iranian forces confirmed 21 separate attacks on merchant ships. Reports emerged of sea mines being laid in the strait. War risk insurance premiums, which had been at 0.125% of ship value per transit before the war, surged immediately. Shipping companies did not wait for orders. They stopped sending vessels through. Think about what that means in practice. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of the world's oil supply, not 20% of some regional supply, 20% of all oil moving by sea on the entire planet. On March 19th, Dubai crude oil prices reached $166 per barrel, their highest level ever recorded. By late March, Brent crude was at $114. California gasoline prices crossed $5 per gallon. And here is the dimension of this that goes far beyond gas prices. The strait does not just carry crude oil. It carries liquefied natural gas. It carries sulfur, ammonium, and phosphate, the raw materials without which fertilizer cannot be made. It carries the chemical feedstocks for semiconductor manufacturing. When the strait closes, the disruption does not stay in energy markets. It propagates through food production timelines, through technology supply chains, through every industry that depends on the materials that used to flow through that 40-kilometer-wide passage between Iran and Oman. 230 loaded oil tankers were confirmed waiting inside the Persian Gulf by April 9th, unable to exit. 20,000 seafarers trapped aboard vessels in a war zone, unable to leave their ships. The International Maritime Organization's Maritime Safety Division was describing the humanitarian crisis for those crews as urgent and unprecedented. Now let us talk about the ceasefire that was announced on April 8, 2026, because this is where the situation becomes most revealing about the true state of this conflict and who actually has the leverage. President Trump announced a 2-week pause in U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran. The stated condition was the complete, immediate, and safe reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran confirmed it would allow shipping to resume during the 2-week period. Within hours of the announcement, the fragile nature of that agreement was visible to anyone watching. Israel, which is not party to the ceasefire in the same way, continued its strikes on Lebanon targeting Hezbollah. Iran's IRGC stated that oil tanker traffic through the strait had been halted again in response to those Lebanese strikes. The White House disputed that. Iran's foreign ministry disputed the White House's account. Kuwait reported fresh drone attacks hours after the ceasefire took effect. Saudi Arabia confirmed that its crucial east-west pipeline, the route that bypasses the strait entirely and connects Gulf oil fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, had been damaged in the fighting. Iran's newly appointed supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who inherited authority after Ali Khamenei was killed in an Israeli strike earlier in the conflict, struck a tone that was not conciliatory. He said the Strait of Hormuz will be brought into a new phase of management. He said Iran will certainly punish the aggressors. He said Iran will demand compensation for all damages. And he said Iran will achieve a decisive victory over its enemies, whether in negotiations or on the battlefield. That is not the language of a government that believes it lost this conflict. By April 9th, the day after the ceasefire was announced, the strait was still effectively closed. 6 ships had transited in the first 24 hours. 6 ships, against the normal rate of over 100 per day. Abu Dhabi National Oil Company's chief executive confirmed publicly that the strait was not open, that Iran was restricting and conditioning traffic, that over 200 loaded oil tankers remained trapped inside the Gulf. And this is the structural fact that will define what comes next. Iran has offered to toll tankers passing through, over $1 million per ship. The White House called any such toll completely unacceptable. But the question is not what the White House calls it. The question is, who controls the 40-kilometer-wide passage through which 20% of the world's energy flows? And right now, sitting on this fragile ceasefire with negotiations beginning in Islamabad this weekend, the answer to that question is not the United States. Now, I want to connect all of this to the deeper structural reality, because what has happened over the past 40 days is not just a military exchange. It is a demonstration of how control actually works in the modern world and who actually holds it. America entered this conflict with complete air superiority over Iran. U.S. and Israeli aircraft can strike virtually anywhere inside Iranian territory. Iran's air force has been largely neutralized. U.S. F-35s conducted strikes throughout the country. The IDF announced that an Israeli F-35 shot down an Iranian Yak-130 fighter jet in the first air-to-air kill by an F-35 in history. Iran's nuclear facilities at Isfahan, Natanz, and elsewhere were struck. Senior IRGC commanders were eliminated. The Basij headquarters was hit. Mojtaba Khamenei himself survived an airstrike. By almost every conventional military measure, the 40-day campaign achieved significant damage to Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure. And yet, the Strait of Hormuz is not open. The world's energy markets are still in crisis. Oil is still above $95 a barrel 3 days after a ceasefire was announced. 230 loaded tankers are still waiting inside the Gulf. Iran is still standing. Its government is still functioning. Its new supreme leader is talking about a new phase of management of the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran shot down a U.S. F-15E fighter jet over Iranian territory on April 3rd, the first American combat aircraft lost over Iran since the war began. A downed pilot was found and rescued after a firefight. 13 U.S. service members have been killed in this conflict so far. These are real losses. They are not abstractions. And they matter because they point directly at the limitation that no amount of air power has been able to resolve. You can bomb a country's military infrastructure, you can kill its leaders, you can destroy its missile production facilities, you can eliminate 3/4 of its mobile launchers, and if that country controls a physical choke point through which the world's energy supply must pass, and if that country is prepared to endure the bombing rather than surrender that control, then the bombing does not solve the problem. It demonstrates the problem. This is what the 40 days of Operation Epic Fury have revealed. Not American defeat, not Iranian victory, something more complicated and more significant than either. It revealed the limit of what even the most powerful air campaign in modern history can achieve against an adversary who is not trying to defeat the attacking force militarily, but is simply making the cost of staying more expensive than the cost of leaving. Iran's strategy in this conflict is not difficult to describe. Fire enough missiles at enough targets across enough countries that the economic cost of continuing the war becomes politically unsustainable in Washington. Close the Strait of Hormuz so that every barrel of oil above $100 is a daily reminder to every government on earth of what this war costs. Survive the bombing, hold the choke point, wait for the ceasefire, then negotiate from a position of physical control rather than diplomatic goodwill. And here is the question that the Islamabad talks this weekend must answer. What does Iran actually give up if it signs a permanent agreement? If Iran opens the Strait of Hormuz and accepts constraints on its nuclear program, it loses the two most powerful leverage points it currently holds over the United States and the global economy. What does it get in exchange? That is the negotiation. And based on everything that has happened in the past 40 days, Iran knows what its leverage is worth. It knows because the entire world watched the ceasefire announcement cause U.S. crude prices to drop 16% in a single day. That is how much the Strait of Hormuz blockade was costing. 16% of the global crude price lifted in one announcement. That is the economic weapon Iran controls. Whether or not it signs an agreement that permanently surrenders that weapon depends on what Washington is prepared to offer. And that calculation, the gap between what Washington can offer and what Tehran will accept, is the open question that will determine whether the 2-week ceasefire becomes a foundation for something more durable or simply a pause before the next escalation. Iran's parliament speaker said openly that time is running out. Iran's foreign minister said trust with Washington is at zero. Vice President Vance called the disagreement over Lebanon's inclusion in the ceasefire a legitimate misunderstanding. Mediator Pakistan says the ceasefire includes Lebanon. Washington says it does not. Tehran says it does. And meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz is managing, in the IRGC's own words, a new phase. This is not a story that has reached its conclusion. The 40-day war did not produce a winner and a loser the way that phrase is usually understood. It produced a ceasefire under circumstances where both sides claim victory, where the central condition of the agreement is actively disputed, where the physical choke point at the heart of the conflict is still not functioning normally, and where the negotiations beginning this weekend will determine whether this was the end of something or the pause before something larger. What I can tell you is this. The structural forces that drove this conflict, Iran's missile program, the Strait of Hormuz as a leverage instrument, the cost asymmetry between cheap missiles and expensive interceptors, Israel's accelerating interceptor production, the fragility of Gulf state stability, none of these forces have been resolved by 40 days of bombing. They have been demonstrated. And demonstrating a structural reality is not the same thing as changing it. The negotiations in Islamabad this weekend are not just about Iran's nuclear program or the Strait. They are about whether the framework of American power in the Middle East that has existed since 1973 is being negotiated on its own terms, or whether it is being renegotiated on terms that Iran, holding the physical choke point, has a significant role in shaping. That is the question this war has opened. History does not always provide clean answers, but it always forces the question. And this question, who controls the passage through which a fifth of the world's energy flows and on what terms, is now being asked openly in the middle of a fragile ceasefire, with 230 oil tankers waiting inside a gulf that the whole world is watching. That is the situation as of today. That is where control actually sits right now.